Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's good to have a chance to share some of my ideas around Superbosses, and I'm really interested in what you have to say about that. And I'm going to have some questions for you as well. The professor can't help that type of stuff. So let's start with, I'm a foodie. I'm really into great restaurants. That's why I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, for example. And one of the things I noticed in the early days of kind of getting interested a little bit about talent is I heard about this woman that after graduating from college, she went to France and she lived the Parisian lifestyle. She went to the markets, she always had fresh food, organic food, sustainable, farm to table, all the rest of it that comes from the local markets that Europe has been far ahead of America on. And she comes back to America after a few years and she says, I want to create a restaurant that will be a platform to tell America, to help America understand how to eat better, how to eat good food. Again, natural ingredients, organic, local sourcing, supporting local farmers, very high quality. And she opens up a restaurant in Oakland, in Berkeley, by the name of Chef Panis. And some of you will know who this is. It's Alice Waters, legendary chef who, along with being this innovator when it comes to food, also has, over the course of her career, and I'll say so far because she's still going strong, has spawned literally over 200 people. Over 200 people that have worked for her at some stage in their careers have gone on to tremendous success in their own right, either opening up their own restaurants, maybe going into the bakery business, the cheese business, running restaurants, being in venture capital and finance around the food industry, a tremendous track record. And I said, wow, here's somebody who's really kind of interesting, kind of cool. And what she has been able to do after a long period of studying a lot of companies and doing a lot of work with a lot of organizations, I came to realize, at least in my mind, is I'm going to say the single most important thing for any organization to survive and thrive into the long term. And that is the ability to generate and regenerate talent on a continuous basis. That's what she did. So I found somebody like that and I said, well, this is kind of cool. Let me see if I can find somebody else. And I decided, let's look at a completely different industry. And I looked at professional football, the NFL. And it turns out that when you look at the NFL, there's one head coach that has had an outsized influence in the development of other head coaches throughout the history of the NFL. Does anyone know who that might be? Any guesses? Bill Walsh, right. Bill Walsh, San Francisco 49ers. In fact, one of the nice things about professional football and sports is a lot of data, so I actually could quantify this. And so what I did is I looked at all of the Super Bowl head coaches of the winning team and the losing team, so the two best head coaches in a particular year, and I did a genealogical study of them. And by that I mean not their parents, but who they work for. And I created these trees of talent. And when I did that, it turned out that Bill Walsh was far and away ahead of everybody else. Number two, by the way, we're in Boston, so I could tell you it's Bill Parcells. And the reason is because he has one protege that is in the Super Bowl almost every year, and that's Bill Belichick. And so actually this past year, back in February in the Super Bowl, the two head coaches both came from the Bill Walsh tree of talent. This is, by the way, 10 years after he died, and 20 years after he was a head coach. I mean, unbelievable legacy. So I found somebody in football, pretty different from high-end restaurants, and I thought, okay, this is fun. Let's keep going. And then I decided, let's look at hedge funds. There's no connection here. They're just out of the blue. And hedge funds, turns out it's Julian Robertson from Tiger Management. Some of you know that industry, might know. Tiger Cubs, Tiger Seeds, tremendous number of people that work for Julian have become very successful in the hedge fund business. And turned out to be actually pretty easy to find that. You start talking to people and you ask them, and everyone keeps telling you the same name. And at some point you realize you found the guy or you found the woman. And so I kept going, and I ended up looking at Ralph Lauren in fashion, American fashion. The people that have worked for Ralph Lauren, I don't know if you know some of them. It's a long, long list. Vera Wang, Tory Burch, John Varvatos, Joseph Abboud, the CEO today of Michael Kors. His name is John Idle. Long, long list. Heather mentioned Lorne Michaels from SNL, George Lucas for special effects in film, Roger Corman for B-level films, actually, for those of you who follow that. Larry Ellison for being Larry Ellison, and about 18 in all, 18 really different industries. And so it's kind of interesting. Every industry I looked at, I was able to find the one person that had this outsized ability, track record of developing talent. And that's interesting, but that's just interesting. what do you do with that? And so I started studying them and interviewing a lot of the people that work for them, a lot of the proteges, hundreds of interviews over many years of looking at this. And what I was interested in understanding is, what do they do that's different? What do these people do that's different than other good bosses or other good leaders? And that's what I want to talk about in the time that we have this afternoon. Some of the highlights of that. So, number one, it starts with, and I call this a Superboss playbook. It starts with talent, finding great talent. And what does that mean when it comes to what Superbosses did? Well, they will look for talent in unusual places. Bill Walsh is a good example, actually. One of the major reasons why there are any African-American head coaches in the NFL is because of Bill Walsh. He saw an untapped talent pool. Ex-NFL players, very smart, very capable, motivated, that happened to be African-American. And he purposely looked for that talent and created a variety of training and development programs for them. And they became assistant coaches for him and moved all the way out to becoming a head coach. In that industry at that time, that was an untapped talent pool. Or Jay Chiat Day, big advertising agency. Chiat Day is the agency that did the 1984 Apple ad. That's kind of legendary during the Super Bowl. If you've watched Mad Men, you know it's missing at the top of advertising agencies in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and that's women. And he saw that too, and he said, this is an untapped talent pool. That's nuts. Let's go purposely seek out women that have the potential, the talent, and let's fast track them into bigger opportunities. So one of the nice side effects of a Superboss mindset when it comes to talent is you get more diversity. I don't know that they set out to get diversity in and of itself, but they got it. They'll hire people without a job description, which traditional HR people, they kind of freak out a little bit with that. There's a famous story about Ralph Lauren. He's in a restaurant in New York with his family, having dinner, and a table next to him, there's a group of 3 women, one of whom is dressed really kind of cool and special, and her clothes were making a statement. Ralph noticed her. And over the course of the dinner, they're chatting a little bit on and off. You know, that happens sometimes. And Ralph and his family are done with dinner, and they get up to leave. But before he leaves, he goes over to her, and he takes his business card out, and he gives it to her, and he says, she didn't recognize who he was, and he never said his name. And he says to her, I'd like you to come in if you have a chance tomorrow to the office. I want to offer you a job. And she looks down and says, Ralph Lauren's offering me a job? What's going on? Can you hire thousands of people like that? If you have thousands of talent spotters, you might be able to. Every single person in an organization should become a talent scout, a talent spotter. Wherever you go, the antenna should be up. Is this someone that has something special, some energy, some potential? Doesn't mean you hire them on the spot, but maybe you build beginning of a relationship, you find out what they're doing, and you look for those opportunities. Hiring people without a job description. What do they look for specifically? So there are a lot of different industries, so the details differ, of course, right? But there were 4 characteristics or attributes that I kept seeing among the people that were getting hired, that Superbosses liked, that they ended up hiring. And those 4 things were, number 1 is intelligence, extreme intelligence, ideally. Not just IQ, could be EQ, emotional intelligence, relationship skills, depends on what the business is. And some of these people were legendary for this. Do you ever hear the story about Larry Ellison about that? He used to tell the people doing, his trainers and his HR people that were doing interviews, make sure at some point you ask the candidate, are you the smartest person you know? That's the question. So how do you answer that? If you answer yes, interview continues. You answer no, who is? It's Mary, who I work with for a couple of years. And he says, well, let me go find Mary, you can go, the interview's over. Sounds like a Larry Ellison thing, doesn't it? But it gives you an idea of the extremes to which they went. So, intelligence, creativity. As you'll see, a big part of what Superbosses do is they unleash the creativity of individuals doing whatever it is they're doing. Flexibility. They like people that have the aptitude and interest to do a lot of different things, that could be moved from one job to another to take full advantage of their skills, of their mindset, and of their fresh look at something. And the 4th thing I kept seeing was competitiveness. They love competitive people. I don't know that all 4 of these are original. It's not like Google doesn't want smart people, doesn't want competitive people, doesn't want creative people. But this is what Superbosses we're looking for. These are the 4 things I kept seeing. Anyways, there's a lot more I could say about talent, but I'm just going to kind of highlight a few things about the Superboss playbook to give you a bit of a flavor, and depending on what you ask me afterwards, I can go into it in more detail. So you have great talent. What's the next thing you do? Well, you got to energize them. You got to motivate them. They got to be ready for action. And one thing about living in a Superboss world is the bar is high and it keeps getting higher. It's not for everyone. You got to be willing to work hard and be willing to excel at whatever it is you're going to do. They're not soft touches. They're not all the same personality, but they're not soft touches. They push you and they push you hard. I don't think that's all that shocking either. How many people live in a 24/7 world these days anyways? A lot of people work really, really hard. But what Superbosses add that I found many, many managers up and down organizations don't do very well is that they really inspire the people that work for them to feel like there's nothing they can't do. Again, Ralph Lauren used to say to the people in his team, we are the ones that set the standard. Everyone else follows us. We don't follow them. And you better believe that. You better be authentic with that. You can't fake a thing like that. But that was what he was. That was the message he was communicating. He truly believed it. People that worked for Ralph and many of the other Superbosses, they felt almost like they were the chosen ones, that they were special to have that opportunity. And many of the interviews, they said something like, the one thing I never wanted to do is let my boss down. I never wanted to let Tommy Frist, CEO of HCA, I never wanted to let him down. So they inspire people, they energize people. And that is a really important part of being an effective leader, no matter what job you've got, because you got to give people a reason why they need to go through brick walls and do unbelievable things. And some people are internally motivated, but at some point people burn out also. And that inspiration part is a gigantic, if it's genuine, if it's authentic, is a gigantic factor that keeps people in the game and makes them feel like they're really accomplishing something special. Related to that is the V word, the vision word. It's absolutely true that Superbosses have these broad, powerful visions. Alice Waters from Chef Panis Restaurant, her vision was to create a restaurant that is this platform, as I said, to change the way America eats. That's a gigantic, crazy vision. George Lucas had a vision to create what eventually became Star Wars. But there was no technology available to do it. He had to invent, which is really kind of amazing. He had to invent countless new digital technologies to accomplish that. But that was the vision he was driving towards. Ralph Lauren is the same way. This idea of clothes being part of your lifestyle and integrating in a way that's consistent with his image of life as a movie, really. They have these visions, and they will not compromise on those visions. If you don't like that vision, if you can't live with that vision, you will not succeed. You may be hired, it would be a mistake, and you will not last. You have to buy into the vision. I call this, one of the chapters, the title of the chapter is Uncompromisingly Open. So you heard the uncompromising part, but what about the open part? And this is one of these counterintuitive things that Superbosses do. At the same time as having this expansive vision, at the same time, they unleash the creativity of the people in their organizations, of their team members, of their peers. And the reason they do that is because they feel so strongly about fulfilling whatever their goal is, their vision is, that they want every idea you've got. They want all the best ideas. They don't think they've got all the answers. They're constantly looking for better solutions. So often I heard from my interviews this idea of how a superboss would be so excited and found it so rewarding to learn something new from someone who worked for her or for him. Many, many bosses have a very different philosophy about that. But they love the idea of learning something. And they love a good fight. They love a good disagreement. I mean, of course, Larry Ellison's famous for that, but every one of the Superbosses were. And doesn't mean you always win the battle or win the argument with your boss, but they wanted someone that was willing to go for it. Had something to say, you said it. And if you thought it's the right idea, you engage in the discussion, and you're not afraid to tell your boss or your colleagues, I think you're wrong about this, here's why, in an analytical, careful way. They love that. They value that. And so you have an interesting situation where you have this uncompromising vision, but yet all these ideas, whatever you've got, is important. Creativity becomes part of your everyday job, no matter what it is you do. If there's a If you're trying to create something new, you might have some skunk works or some task force. That might happen. But more likely than not, everyone every day is supposed to keep thinking of new ways of doing things. And if you work for someone like that or with people like that, it's pretty exciting, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty powerful because it means you count. It means every individual has the potential to make a difference. You may know about employee engagement scores, which Gallup keeps reporting, and they vary a lot, of course, but the biggest survey from Gallup from about a year ago showed something like 25% of all employees said that they were highly engaged at work. I mean, 25%. That's unbelievable. That means 75% said either they were not engaged or a little bit engaged or just a touch engaged or whatever. Not highly engaged. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's not just a managerial failure. That's actually a leadership failure. That's actually a moral failure if you really think about it. That so many people go to work and don't feel fulfilled in any particular way from that work. That's wrong. And leaders need to do everything they can to make sure that doesn't happen in their worlds. And the benefits are endless because you end up with better talent. You end up with more motivated, energized talent. As a result, you do better, they do better, the organization will do better, and yet you'll be helping them accomplish more. So if you put together what I've said so far, what did I say? They find unusual talent. They look for diamonds in the rough, and they push them hard, and they create a high performance culture, and they inspire them to really feel like they can do anything. And they have a vision that is motivating and is exciting that you want to be part of. And you unleash the creativity of people around you. What kind of organization do you create when you do a thing like that? I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing that you can do. And in fact, you create an organization that I think will be much more adaptable and adjustable and agile, if you want to use that word, than a lot of other organizations and a lot of other teams. There's some of you may know either from reading something or business school or who knows where, but there's a dominant model of change or change management in business. Almost everyone around the world that's a senior executive seems to know this, and it came from some work by John Cotter at HBS over a number of decades. And the model is that if you want people to change, you need to create a sense of urgency. It's a common term, right? You got to give people a real sense of urgency, or the other term people use is a burning platform. Create a burning platform to get people to change. I mean, think about that. Isn't that crazy? You need to have your house virtually on fire before you do anything about it. You need to be almost in the hospital before you start eating better or exercising. Why do we need to create a view of the world of change that we have to be in a disastrous situation before we actually do something about that? A lot of big companies have fallen by the wayside exactly because of that mentality. Jim Collins, famous from Good to Great, of course, wrote a book called Built to Last a few years before that. And I think built to last is the wrong metaphor. I think actually what we want in teams and in organizations is to be built to change. I think built to change is much more powerful because that's going to allow you, or at least increase the odds of you being adaptable, adjustable, flexible, agile, dealing with the famous disruptions that are going on everywhere and being ahead of the curve in that. And the irony is, I think, when you create an organization that is built to change, you actually last a lot longer. So, the Superboss mindset, the Superboss playbook is not just about leadership. It's not just about how to work more effectively. It's not just about helping other people get better, although it's about all of those things. It's also about building an organization that's much more adaptable, adjustable, and agile. Let me say one last part. And I'm skipping over a few things, so we can get to that afterwards. But one last part of the Superboss playbook that I think is important, and then we'll open up for some questions to see what you want to talk about. I didn't really say anything about how Superbosses develop talent on a day-to-day basis. And so let me say a little bit about that. And it turns out that over a matter of centuries, there has been one dominant method of people learning their craft or their skill or their capability. And it's been going on really for centuries. And of course, that's called an apprenticeship, right? That's how it worked. Leonardo da Vinci was in the workshop of Verrocchio in Florence. That's how he learned at the beginning of his career when he was 13 years old, when he went in the work. Everyone learned that way. But where are these apprenticeships today? Some companies say or tell me, yeah, we do that, but I haven't seen very much of it. It's unusual. And maybe you'll see it for some technical skills, but for management and for leadership, much less likely. And so what Superbosses have done is they've resurrected, in their own way, an apprenticeship model to developing talent. So let me tell you in brief what that means. Number one, big opportunities for people. If you see someone that has potential, you look for big opportunities, you delegate big to them. I gave a talk to a different group not that long ago, and there's a CHRO, Chief HR Officer of a Fortune 100 company that was there. In the Q&A, he raised his hand and he said, I want to tell you what happened to me. When I was 28 years old, my boss gave me an assignment to go to Japan and become the HR director in Japan at the age of 28. And he wasn't a Japanese native, he wasn't a Japanese speaker. And he told his boss, no, are you crazy? There's no way I can do that. And his boss, of course, told him, or his super boss told him, I wouldn't ask you to do it. I wouldn't give you this opportunity if I wasn't very, very sure that you could do it. And I'll support you in the beginning, but then you're going to figure it out. And so he ended up doing that. He was there, I think, for 4 or 5 years. And as he was describing it, he talked about how, it changed his life. Because he did something that was really, really hard. He worked like crazy to do it. I mean, the cultural difference, the language difference, you can imagine. And at that age as well, in a culture that's quite, where hierarchy and age means a lot. But he did it, and he succeeded. And after that, he felt like there's nothing he couldn't do. That there's nothing he couldn't accomplish. And I'm sure that some of you, maybe many of you, have had either a boss or a colleague, or maybe even a teacher, that has given you that gift. Given you this tremendous opportunity that when you accomplish that, you fulfill that. It's just, it accelerates your career. It builds tremendous confidence. And that's also a gift that you can do when you have people that work for you or your colleagues as well, to give them those types of opportunities. That's a big part of the apprentice approach. I'll say 2 other things about the apprentice approach, and then finally Q&A. Along with big delegation and opportunities, it turns out that superbosses don't just delegate and forget. They will roll up their sleeves and work very closely with people on their team periodically. They will get close to that line that everybody tells you don't want to be close to. The line starts with micro and ends in management. Right? No, that's a bad thing. Everybody says that. And I don't call them micromanagers in any traditional sense. To me, a micromanager is someone who does their team members' work. They don't do that. But they don't exactly ignore what's going on. They will parachute in sometimes. They'll show up at meetings. They'll spend half a day going through a project. And what are they doing? They're not doing your work, but they're teaching you, they're pushing you, they're changing the rules of the game as you're going along to try to understand it better. It's like getting a one-on-one tutorial with a true master, somebody who's been doing something for 10 or 20 years, or even 2 or 3 years, depending on the industry. Very, very powerful. Very, very powerful. And a lot of people look at this and say, well, how can that happen? Many people talk about, you ask them about their boss, and they say, well, my boss is a big delegator. And other people say, I'm stuck with, she's a micromanager. It turns out as soon as you open your head and say, these are not the same continuum, where you're either a delegator or a micromanager, but there's 2 lines going on at the same time. And you could be a big delegator and a small delegator, and you could be a big micromanager and a very little micromanager. As soon as you realize that, which is true, you could imagine how these 2 things could be combined. So, actually I have a lot more I could say, but I want to leave time to kind of talk about what you want to talk about. So let's, should we open it up for some Q&A, and I'll weave in a few other stories, but I'm really interested in what you're wondering about from this.
I have 2 questions. The first is, you're talking a lot about the super bosses from the point at which they already are bosses, and maybe I missed this at the beginning, but I'm curious if there are any patterns about their own development to before they were bosses.
Right.
So that's one thing. And then the second thing was, you mentioned George Lucas and his vision, and I've always found it interesting how he sold the franchise to Disney, and part of it is, knowing when to let go of your vision and move on, and I wonder just your thoughts on that. It seemed kind of early in terms of giving it away, but maybe that's part of a key of being able to develop a halo effect of other people taking on your vision and adapting it for their own. So those are my 2 questions.
Right. So first on the George Lucas thing, I think that's probably pretty unusual from the super bosses that I talked to or that I studied, that they would give it up. But it was a certain age, and you got one of these offers you can't refuse type of thing, right? And who would be the best owner of these assets, if it's not George Lucas himself. Most people would probably say a company that knows how to do stuff like that. But that wasn't a common pattern. Most people went, I mean, Ralph Lauren, what is he, 75 or something like that? He just now recently appointed a new CEO, and he's the chair. So he's not ready to step aside. Julian Robertson's 80 years old. He's still somewhat, not nearly as much, somewhat involved. So the first question, how do you get to, what do they do along the way to become that super boss? So one thing is true, super bosses do create more super bosses. So I saw that by many of the proteges that I talked to, or I call them protege, but former team members. In many instances, and not all, because there's some attrition, but in many instances they learned, I asked in my interviews, what did you learn? And that could be an hour-long discussion around that. And it was very specific, and it almost always included, along with some very specific things to that industry, a lot of ideas about developing talent, thinking about people a little bit differently. And I think the other thing that's I can't say it's a conclusion, it's more like an observation, is a number of super bosses really felt like they had something to prove, almost like they had a chip on their shoulder, which doesn't make you, if you measure that, does that predict being a super boss? No, but going backwards, I say, actually a surprising number did. A Larry Ellison and Norman Brinker from casual restaurant industry, and a whole bunch of them. Bill Walsh was passed over as the head coach for, I think it was Cincinnati Bengals or Cleveland Browns, one or the other. When he was ready, thought he was ready, and he vowed right then that when he has a chance to be a head coach, he's never going to do that to someone who's ready. And actually what he did, which is really unusual, I didn't talk about this part yet, but Bill Walsh would actually, when it was a head coach opening, he would actually pick up the phone and call an owner and tell the owner, you should hire one of my assistant coaches if he thought they were ready. And that's really extreme, because you are now giving one of your best talents to a direct competitor. But that's kind of what he did. He felt so strongly about that. So there's a couple of thoughts about that.
The way that you're describing super bosses, it sounds like a very personal experience, like person-to-person experience. While will grow like a tree, doesn't really scale that quickly. Have you seen any examples where the super boss lessons have been institutionalized or taught in a more rapid pace?
Right. There's a great question about scaling. And early on, as part of the research, I studied super boss-like companies to see what they had done. In the end, I ended up interested in the origins of how does it start, because it always starts with people, number one, and number two, any individual can be a more effective leader by adopting the super boss ideas. So that's why I did it that way, but in fact there are a number of examples. I mean, some are famous. GE has been known for that, for having that reputation, but McKinsey is like that. I think at one point Goldman Sachs was. One of my best examples is that I looked at is actually Second City, the comedy group from Chicago, or actually around the world now, Second City. I started to look at Second City because I was interested. Was there another super boss in the comedy world besides Lorne Michaels from SNL? And I couldn't find anyone within Second City. And I thought that was cool and interesting because they have produced hundreds of talent. So how'd that happen? And then I ended up spending a long time with them and did a whole big analysis, and it turns out it had been inculcated into their culture. Many of the things I'm talking about, it wasn't one person doing it, it was a whole bunch of people doing it. Now, how do you actually make that happen now as opposed to studying a company or an organization that's like that? That's what I'm spending a ton of my time on. I think you actually can do that. First of all, you need to know whether you have, not whether, because every company has super bosses. Every company has super bosses. I know this because you probably think about it and you know super bosses, but I've done a lot of book signings, and people ask me to sign a book over their boss who's a super boss, and they tell me the story about that person, and somebody I never heard of in a company I barely knew existed. There are plenty, but do we know who they are in an organization? That seems like a baby step. Why aren't we, and I'm doing that in my own work right now with an assessment, why aren't we trying to measure whether we have any super bosses, and then figure out what are they doing that has been tailored to this particular culture, and then figure out a way to teach that or share that. There's also like any type of attempt to scale, there's an entire curriculum that we're actually developing. You could imagine it's not like classroom curriculum, it'll be a platform and other things that will help people become more effective as leaders, adopting a bunch of the super boss the Superboss ideas. So if you're starting with none of that, it's going to take some time. Is it scalable? I think it is, because I see these companies exist. Not going to happen. Not going to happen overnight.
You have talked about superbosses, people who manage teams and inspire people to do something. Have you studied super teachers, people who teach people and inspire them to learn more, to educate themselves, and so on?
Super teachers.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're very similar as far as I could tell. You know, in academia, the idea of having a famous academic that has a lot of PhD students that go on to great success, that's there in every field. I think there's even a website for mathematicians that come from, some of you will know who it is, I don't remember the name, some very famous mathematician, many, an incredible number of people. In my own field of studying organizations, there are two really famous, there are a lot of famous, but there are two really famous people that go back in time that wrote a bunch of books and other things that became highly influential. And one of them is named Jim March, who's still around, and the other one is Herb Simon. Now, Herb Simon might be a name some of you may recognize. He won a Nobel Prize in economics, the first non-traditional economist to win that. Fascinating. Jim March today, you could look at hundreds of his family tree that are among the absolute leaders around the world in organizational studies, in business schools and companies and consulting firms and the like. And you look at Herb Simon, and there's hardly anyone, which is really kind of fascinating. Just not what he wanted to do. So I didn't study it formally. I do have in the book a story about what I learned from my own superboss, my own PhD mentor and advisor. That was remarkably similar to what these others did. But I'm quite certain that if I were to do that type of study, it would be actually kind of easy. I think there would be people like that in virtually every field. And I suspect in some ways they'll be even more like the classic superboss in the sense that when you in academia, when you work for when you're working under a professor, you will almost always have to leave. You get a degree, you got to get a job somewhere else, and that's the hallmark of what superbosses do. You look at an industry, and you see a lot of the very successful people, and a disproportionate number of them all came from the same person. But in a corporate setting, we say, well, we don't want to lose all our best talent. We want to keep some of that talent. And in an academic setting, that's just the way it works. You might bring them back at some point, but almost everyone ends up going off somewhere else. So, a couple of thoughts about that.
You talked a little bit about superbosses being able to identify other superbosses, but what about someone who's looking to identify a superboss who doesn't know they're a superboss?
Right.
Like, how do you go the other way and
Right.
find the mentors you want to work with?
Right. So I think this is it's a great question, a great thing to think about. When I talk about this with my MBA students, the number one question. I talk about it with undergraduates, and it's the number one question, of course. But I think it's relevant for anyone almost at any stage of career. So I'm a big fan of when you're in an interview with your prospective boss, I think you want to really plan out how you will interview the interviewer. It's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. And what do you want to know? Well, I would want to know, and I'm not going to give you the right wording exactly, but what I'd want to know is, well, tell me about some of the people that used to work for you. Where are they today? What do you want to hear? Some superstars, people you heard of, or at least people you can check on later that you know have done really well. Do you stay in touch with people that used to work for you? How often are there job openings in your team? You can kind of figure that out even before that. This is actually one of the metrics I've been playing with, and I'd be curious about reaction to that, which is in a company, you have these internal job boards, or whatever you call them, you've got them too. And if there's a manager where whenever there's a job opening, it gets closed up really fast, versus a manager where it seems to always be, they always need to be hiring somebody, and they're growing at the same pace, so you got to control for that, right? I won't say it's definitive, but it's indicative that the manager where everyone keeps wanting to get into that place, and there's the jobs close down fast, there's something going on there. People know, and internally you get to know a lot. So another way to do it is keep your eyes open and alert. Like be mindful, if you will, about the people that you work with and the people that you interact with in and outside of Google, for that matter, for people that seem to have some of what I'm talking about. And one other thing I like to ask, well, I don't ask, but I recommend asking, I don't need a job anymore, is I like to ask the interviewer, like you'd ask the interviewer, how do you spend your day? What does a typical day look like? So it's a trick question, because if they say, I'm in meetings from morning to night, you don't have a super boss. Super bosses will never let themselves get so choreographed, so locked up, so they have no time to just kind of plop down next to you and spend 30 minutes to kind of drilling into you to push you a little harder and make sure you're doing what you should be doing and maybe get your feedback. Of course, you have meetings. If I can get rid of meetings, I'm going to be I'll be on Mount Rushmore or something. But do we have to have meetings all day long? And some people, they let that happen. I consider that the fault of the individual, not the fault of anyone else. You can control that. Some meetings you got to go to, but you don't have to go to everything. Anyways, so that's another. I'm sure there are a bunch of others. Actually, as I think about it, I think in the last chapter, chapter 9, I think I have a bunch of some of these and probably a few other questions that you could ask or at least look for when you're trying to find a super boss.
For a fair amount of people, they don't have much interest in actually being a manager or a boss. But are there any skills that you find that super bosses have, or that people who are not looking to manage can leverage?
Yeah, great question. So in fact, I think many of the things that super bosses do that help other people get better are good things. Because it's a good thing to help other people get better. They're colleagues of yours. It's nobody really works alone. So they're peers. It could be task forces, whatever. And so, for example, feedback is a gigantic thing. Super bosses, all good managers really, love feedback, constant feedback. This. I'm not sure how Google does this, but there's been such a trend now, finally, towards blowing up the annual performance review that has gotten so many. It destroys more than it creates value. And what you should be doing is constant feedback. You giving it, you taking it. So that's an easy one to do for anyone, whether you got a boss or not, right? The creativity side is challenging people that are working with you, because you want to learn from them. I think you can do that. I think the idea of even being a talent scout or a talent spotter might be relevant. It's not that you're hiring them for your team, but you care about your company or your unit or your team, and you want to look for you want to surround yourself with other great people. Probably if we went through every one of the elements of the playbook, I don't know about all of the elements, but I bet a bunch of them will be I think, easily transferable.
I have a question, just building on that. So one of the things that I had written down very similarly to what you had said is this idea of super teams, or the point of how peers cultivate talent,
Right.
Which you addressed. I'm wondering if you found any also like super partnerships. So people who have partnered together that have developed something special between each other and really developed talent. I think about Larry and Sergey, right? We're all probably thinking about a lot of Google examples.
Sure.
Did you find any of these partnerships?
Yeah.
Or teams? I think Second City
Right.
might be an example of
Right.
it.
A really good example is Lennon and McCartney. I'm reading yet another book on the Beatles, so it's fresh in my mind. When John Lennon wrote a great song, Paul McCartney said, "I'm going to write a better song." When McCartney wrote a great song, Lennon said, well, I was about to say what he said. He's going to create a better song. But at the same time, virtually every song they wrote, they collaborated. Paul would show up to John. He'd have the beginning and the end. He'd have the tune, but it's missing the middle eight, as they call it, or vice versa. So this is one of the kind of really interesting things that when it comes to teams or maybe partnerships, combining collaboration and competition, another one of these things that most people think are different or opposite, and which they could be, but in fact, combining collaboration and competition at the same time could actually bring out the best. My favorite example of that actually is SNL. I interviewed John Lennon, Lorne, not yet, Lorne Michaels a couple of times, and he told me this, that he came up with this strategy, if you will, and he realized this is great, and he kept doing it. And what is it? To get on SNL, like for a performer to get airtime on SNL, how do you do it? It's not a stand-up comedy show, right? So you got to collaborate. You got to form a skit. You need a writer or two. You need another performer or two. And that's the definition of collaboration. But what Lorne Michaels does is, as you get closer to Friday night, he creates typically as much as 2.5 hours of content or material. but the show's only an hour and a half. And so in the last 36 to 48 hours, you need some pretty sharp elbows to get your airtime on there, because you're going from 2.5 hours to 1.5 hours. And he purposely was doing this. And he said, this is like unbelievable, because they got to work together, but at the same time, I want to see who's got that fire, who can improve their game so much that the audience, and it's not just him, because they do these multiple rehearsals in front of audiences, the audience is going to love it so much. So that's competition. It's a scarce resource. Everybody wants that. So yeah, that combination is pretty interesting.
I have an obvious question. I'm sure you're asked this all the time. Maybe you address it in the book. I haven't read the book. I glanced at the introduction. It looks as though of the Superbosses you interviewed, unless I missed some, only one was a woman, Alice Waters. And I think you mentioned you considered Hillary Clinton and Oprah Winfrey, but I was just noticing yesterday that the law firm Kravitz, Swaine and Moore just appointed its first ever female leader, and apparently of the top 200 law firms in the United States, only 3 are led by women. It seems to me that in all of the characteristics you're talking about Superbosses, nothing strikes me as inherently biased against women, particularly. Of everything you've talked about, I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be a lot more women who have already attained Superboss status. So what are your thoughts on this whole issue? Why don't we have more? Are we going to have more in the future? What are the barriers?
Yeah, so that's I came up against that as part of the research process, and I started searching, and I wasn't particularly successful. I mentioned Sheryl Sandberg in brief. You mentioned Hillary Clinton. Only for the one part of the Superboss playbook I didn't really talk much about. It is the network, and some people consider that a disaster, and some people consider it fantastic. But she has an unbelievable network. Oprah Winfrey, in terms of developing talent, is a good example. Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, but not that many. And I thought about it a lot, and in part, for me to find them, there needs to be a track record of developing talent that have gotten to senior positions, because that was my research strategy. Well, that takes some time, and that means you would have had to be in a very senior position 10, 20, 30 years ago, and of course the sample size is tiny. So I think that's the biggest reason why that happened. What do I predict? I think it'll become, if I were to come back, I don't know, in 10 years, I think it'll be more balanced, not completely balanced, because you can look at who are the CEOs today, and there's still many more men than women. You look at the Fortune 500, you look at board members, you look at senior executives, still very, very imbalanced, but it'll be better. It'll be better. So, but you know, I didn't think there was anything innately odd about what I was finding. I think it's circumstance due to the stage of where we are in terms of the leadership in the economy to a large extent, and hopefully will become a little bit less imbalanced over time. Can I ask everyone a question? Yeah, my question is this. This should be right up your alley. How do you measure whether a company has Superbosses? So I have an assessment. It is a survey. It's been validated over several hundred participants, and we've done all kinds of statistical validation, reliability. It's pretty good, but that's just one, and it's a survey. So it depends on a 360, it depends on a lot of things, and that's always a small sample size. But I want to figure out how do you know? I mean, I just had this conversation with a senior HR person at a big company, and he said, well, how do you really know whether you have Superbosses? My primary answer is, well, the assessment. I can help you with that, but I know that's not enough. And then I said, well, kind of, maybe I forgot who asked the question, but when there's a team that has a revolving door versus a team where as soon as there's an opening it gets closed quickly, you can track that type of data. That's something. You can look at financial performance, presumably. Maybe you can count how many people have gone on to bigger jobs as a percentage over time or some such thing. But I haven't gone further than that. So just off the top of your head, if there are any thoughts.
I assume that if the progression of people into Superbosses as they're being mentored and apprenticed follows a given pattern, that the org chart of the organization would reflect that over time.
The org chart would reflect what exactly?
So if the people in control are raising up giving big opportunities to people underneath them and raising up more people that can take on larger portions of the business. I think that the org chart might be flatter at the higher levels, or maybe take on some other form that could be identified, versus someone who may be very good at the business but is not delegating, not bringing up people underneath them.
Well, that's possible. It's true that one of the other characters of Superbosses, they hate. Maybe everybody hates bureaucracy and hierarchy, but they just whack away at it constantly because they want to be with people doing real work. They don't want to have multiple layers. I know that's a Google thing as well.
So many companies have like the 360 review or manager surveys during the year, and so I think it's about aligning those metrics. So you could do case studies on certain companies where the things that they're asking the understudies and I guess the bosses about are aligned with what you've identified in your book, and then if they're graded this way, then you can quantify it.
So it's part of the internal measurement or metrics of whether you're a good manager.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can work with those companies, I guess, that like Oracle or whoever.
Right.
Okay. To try that.
Good.
To your question, did you come across any situations in which you interviewed people who you consider to be super bosses who describe past scenarios in which the kind of institutional structure of where they were was limiting of their super boss potentials, for instance, and then they left to go somewhere else? Because I came from the world of kind of government and politics where bureaucracy is very rigid, and it makes it very difficult for people who are even charismatic leaders to have that involvement with their staff. And then you see a lot of trends of people moving to, for instance, the tech industry where things are a lot more open and flat. Do you encounter that in your interviews at all, people?
More for the proteges than the actual super bosses, who are some of them are these legendary people. But for the proteges that have done a bunch of different things, yeah, there was some movement towards that, and maybe that's a reflection of certain cultures, if you will, or structures. In your example, are more amenable to super boss approaches and techniques, and others are less so, which I think is right. I think that's right.
In the tech industry, I would say that stints can be shorter, and we see a lot of that. And so who follows the person when the person leaves?
Right.
It goes on to a new venture. So kind of measuring and looking at the
Are you
people
bringing
that
your
follow.
team with you? That type of thing.
Yeah, so we see a lot of for example, we've seen a lot of it, with Cheryl going to Facebook and then, pulling, eventually once the non-compete runs out, pulling a number of people with her or others, right? We see a lot of that.
Right.
And they kind of end up assembling kind of a similar team underneath them.
Right, right. We'll end on one of my favorite stories. I can't say my favorite because they're all my babies. They're all favorites. One of the super bosses, I don't profile him in very much detail, even though I did a big study of him, is Robert Mondavi from, of course, the wine business in Napa. He created essentially the U.S. wine business. Not almost everyone, but a lot of people that became successful in the wine business at some point worked for him and were influenced by him. And so 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe 4 or 5 years ago, one of my consulting clients is a company called Constellation Brands. It's the world's biggest spirits and wine company. They're gigantic, and they bought the Mondavi company probably 10 years earlier when he was retired, and so we did an all-day retreat in Napa, and the top 40 executives from around the world from this company came in, and we were spending the day doing what you do in retreats, and the dinner was going to be at the Mondavi Ranch, which they owned, of course, right? And they invited Mr. Mondavi and his wife to dinner, which was nice. He was long retired, and so he came, and he was in a wheelchair. He was 94, I believe, and he didn't say anything. It wasn't clear what he understood or not. I mean, he was dressed in a suit. His wife had to help him eat. Obviously, he was struggling a little bit at that stage of life, and I happened to be seated at the same table as him, and. As dinner's about to begin, I noticed a couple of the senior executives from Constellation start walking towards our table from another table, and they're going towards Mr. Mondavi, and the next thing I know, I turn around and I realize there's like a line of 20 people waiting their turn to talk to Mr. Mondavi. And you have to picture this. So he's in a wheelchair, so they have to kind of kneel down a little bit to make eye contact. And you know what they say? Almost without exception, they say, "Thank you. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you created. Thank you for creating this incredible opportunity that I've been able to be part of this and create a livelihood for my family and all that you, and he, one after another, kind of the same type of thing. It was really, you see that, you don't forget that. And he never said a word. He didn't say anything. And I don't know whether he really understood or not, but his eyes were sparkling, so I kind of like to think he understood. And that's legacy, isn't it? I mean, that's an unbelievable thing. When all is said and done, are we, each of us, going to have people that have been influenced, where we have been able to change their lives for the better in some way? That's a really powerful thing that goes way beyond wealth and many other things. And Superbosses have done it. Superbosses have done it. So, and I think any one of us have that opportunity to be able to do that. So, thank you very much. Good luck to everyone. I hope to see many more Superbosses here again. Thank you very much.